Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. Today I want to talk with you about the potentially fatal problem with this podcast. Regular listeners may be used to hearing me say that this podcast is designed for members at All Saints, and though, of course, we're glad to have others from outside All Saints listening in, the focus of the subjects we're going to be talking about is going to be to do with things that affect the life of the congregation here at All Saints in Fort Worth. Today is an exception to that rule because the potentially fatal problem that I want to talk about arises from situations where online content or disembodied content in whatever form is the only kind of Christian teaching or discipleship material that you're getting. And I'm conscious that it's possible. Though we don't have a vast audience, we do have some audience outside All Saints, for which we thank God. It's possible that this podcast from time to time, or maybe our other online content here, our sermons and other teaching, is part of a diet of Christian teaching for people who don't have a regular home church, who aren't really part of a Christian community, or you're part of one that you can't really get that enthusiastic about for various reasons. And for you, therefore, this podcast and our other ministries and any other online material that you listen to could be potentially fatal. And when I use the word fatal, I'm only slightly exaggerating. I mean, it could do you real serious spiritual harm. Let me explain where this comes from, what's given rise to this topic for today. It is currently Friday afternoon at about 10 minutes to 2, and as I always do on Friday, I'm spending most of the day preparing my sermon for Sunday. I do some prep during the week, and then towards the end of the week I'm focusing more on that before doing some final prep on Sunday morning. And so Friday afternoon I've been looking at Acts chapter 20, and this is a fascinating chapter. It's actually one of my favourites in the book of Acts. This is the second half of the chapter where Paul arrives at Miletus, the beach town about 50 miles south of Ephesus, where he had previously spent 3 years and a few months preaching and ministering as a pastor. And he calls the elders to him, and he sets out here his philosophy of ministry. Now, this philosophy of ministry is what I'm going to spend Sunday's sermon talking about. The sermon is entitled The Whole Counsel of God. If you're listening to this and want to listen to that sermon, you can do so. It will be on the All Saints website by the time this podcast is up. Though do it with the same caveat that I'm about to issue about this podcast, which is that it could do you harm in those circumstances where you're detached from a real, living, breathing Christian community. And that becomes evident from the first thing that Paul says to the elders of the church in Miletus. And I kid you not, I was sitting at my desk upstairs and I've been working on this, got an outline and got my mind mapping software that I use to kind of pull all the gazillions of random thoughts I have together, and exegetical stuff and theological thoughts and stuff. And I'm starting to write. I'm a couple of pages in. I like to handwrite my notes whenever I can. Stops me writing too much. And I get to verse 18b, where Paul starts his speech to the assembled elders of the church at Ephesus. And listen to what he says. Quote, "You yourselves know how I lived among you the whole time from the first day that I set foot in Asia, serving the Lord with all humility and with tears and with trials. You yourselves know how I lived among you all the time that I was with you." According to, verse 31, it is 3 years. It's actually more than that. He's rounding down here. And it's very striking to me that he begins his recollection to the elders of the church about his philosophy of ministry as a pastor by explaining that they know that he lived among them. Truth is that pastoral ministry is embodied ministry. It has to be. It has to reflect the character of the Christian life. The Christian life is itself not just a philosophy of life. It's not just about ideas. It's not just stuff that you learn. It's not stuff that you think only. It is all those things, but it's more than that. It is a way of life. It is a character-shaping way of life. It's about life together in community. It's about how we actually exist in the world, and therefore to communicate it faithfully, it can't just be done by the downloading of ideas. It's just obvious, isn't it? When God came into the world, he did not come in the form of just ideas. He came as a person, and the person was not merely a philosopher, though he was that. Jesus was, in a sense, the greatest philosopher of all time. But he was more than that. He was a man who lived and breathed and ate and drank, and who showed people the way and said, "Follow me." And there is an extent to which pastors, and Paul really was a pastor in Ephesus, for he stayed there for so long, are called to do the same thing. It's part and parcel of our ministry. And it's very striking to me that he highlights this to the church at Ephesus, because that's part of what he wants to call their attention to as a way of securing them in the things that he's taught them. I'll be quite honest, this is a somewhat uncomfortable thing for me, and I'm sure for any pastor to say, because it runs the risk of giving the impression that we regard this kind of claim as what we've accomplished, or humility and so on. And none of us want to make that claim as something that we've attained, but Scripture says that we're required to hold this out to you, and I think it's, as much as anything, so that you have a standard to hold your pastors to. And you cannot hold people to a moral standard whom you do not know, whose lives you do not share, at least to some extent. I realise, even here at All Saints, in the last few years, as we've gone from being a couple of hundred to 300 and something, all of us see a little bit less of each other, except the small group of friends that perhaps we see more of. And that's inevitable, and perhaps that's also true. I know it's true for me. I see more of you less than I'd like, if that's not too much like Bilbo Baggins. But the principle of living life in a community where, though you might not see everybody every day, you're seeing everybody every week, and you're part of the life of the community. You're spending time with them, and you're spending time with some of the people in the church community visibly all the time, is an important part of pastoral ministry. And now you see why that poses a fatal problem for you if you're just a podcast consumer or just a sermon consumer. You have no way of knowing what I'm like, or what any of the pastors, preachers, teachers, podcasters are like who you listen to. And it turns out that that really matters, which is why Paul starts off with it here. It really matters that the lives of Christian leaders should be validated as faithful and godly by the people who listen to them. You see, therefore, that this is a different problem from what you might think is your principal challenge if you're not in a church community. If you're not in a church, you might think that your main problem is that you don't have relationships with friends and Christian brothers and sisters and a community there to support and encourage you, from whose gifts you can benefit and to whom you can bring gifts that God has given you for service and so on. That's true. That's a significant problem. Perhaps that's the major problem, if you like. I don't know how to categorize these in some kind of hierarchy, but this is a different one. This text highlights how we're exposed to the risk of taking on board teaching from people who might not be all that. They might look great in their carefully curated online content. And look at our beautiful studio here. Look at these wonderful books. And we've made it beautiful. We've got some very aesthetically talented people here at All Saints who put some work into making this place look nice. And to a certain extent, why not? I mean, it's the backdrop that you guys have got to look at if you're on video, watching this on video. But what matters is the character of your teachers. So there it is. Now, I realize that for some people that poses some significant problems. It may be that you're just in a place where there literally isn't a church. Now, I'm being quite generous here. There are a few places on earth that many of us spend much time where there just isn't a church at all. Perhaps active servicemen and women on duty, on active service. You might have a chaplain, but in the most sharp-edged moments in the lives and vocation of people in the military, you probably don't get much choice of church if you get a church at all, even if you do have a chaplain somewhere nearby. And maybe there are people in situations like that. Maybe you're in a situation where there just isn't a church. Well, please, for goodness sake, let's have an exit strategy for that. I mean, if you're in the military, your exit strategy is you're not going to be on active service permanently. Lord willing, you'll return home. But if you're in another situation where there just is not a church, then that's not a sustainable place for you to be. You need to get out of it because you can't survive forever on content like this. Much more common, I suspect, is the experience of people who listen to content like this because they're at a place where there is a church, and perhaps a church that you've been at for some time that you're very thankful for, but it's not the church that you choose. Perhaps it's got some cultural or theological characteristics that you don't feel in conscience you quite jibe with. I suspect in many parts of the US, in fact, I know that in many parts of the US and across the world, and that's actually the case. I have a lot of friends back in England who don't live that close to or anywhere near the kind of church that they'd really like to go to. And so this forms an important part of your spiritual diet. Well, that's good. And I guess in a sense, I want to encourage you to find ways of, drawing into your weekly and daily diet sources of teaching that can add to the instruction and so on that you get from your church that you're actually a part of. But remember, that's not the only thing that a church is for. And there's this line to draw, isn't there, where you want to say, yeah, the teaching and theological outlook of the church really matters. But if you're a dyed-in-the-wool Presbyterian Calvinist and you're in a town where the only church for 50 or 100 miles around is a dispensational Southern Baptist church, then that's going to be your church. And it's going to be helpful for you to find a way of navigating that. Now, in some circumstances, I'd even go so far as to say this. I'd even go so far as to suggest that you go to the pastor and you explain the situation that you find yourself in. I could imagine somebody coming, not really in Fort Worth because there's so many different churches around here, but I can imagine somebody coming to me and saying, hey, pastor, wanted you to know that we've been coming here for a few months and we're very grateful to God for you. We love the people whom we've met here, but in terms of our theological outlook, we find ourselves kind of at odds with a lot of what you teach and stand for. We're going to stay because you're the only game in town. What would you advise as we seek to be a part of this community and we want to serve this community and love the people in it, even while we have some differences of theological outlook? Perhaps that might be helpful to you. I don't think it's necessarily always wise. It's certainly not essential, but I urge you to consider it. If you're in a place, maybe in a small town somewhere in a rural part of America, and there's just one church in town that's really a credible option, and it's just not what you'd have chosen, why not go to the pastor and say, hey, look, I just wanted to initiate a conversation with you and to seek your pastoral advice about how best to be a part of this community, even while I find myself in a different place theologically than you. Be open with your pastor. I think you may be surprised by how positively many pastors receive an approach like that from somebody or a family who is sincerely wanting to love and be a part of and serve within the community, even while they ask the pastor to recognize that they see a few things differently. It may even be that your pastor gives you some things to read and consider and to think about that you find instructive and might even change your perspective on a few things. But one way or another, this can't be your church. This thing here, me tapping the microphone and looking at you if you're watching on video, this can't be it. Not just because you need a church community around you, but because you need to know your pastor. To some degree, you need to know your pastor, or you need to be, I don't want to beat up on churches where they're, 1,000 or 1,200 members and they've been wonderfully blessed, and it's just not the case that everybody knows the pastor, but you are at least in a community where the community knows the pastor and you know that community. Can you see there's a difference between that? Even if you only know the pastor quite vaguely and have never sat down for a meal with him, there's a difference between being integrated into an embodied community where the pastor and the teacher, pastors plural perhaps, are part of that community, and being disengaged from and separate from. Because in the former case and the former case only, it's possible for your pastor to say to you, you know how I lived among you from the whole time I've been with you, the first day that I set foot, in this case in Asia, how I served the Lord with humility. And if that's not something that you can hear, then this podcast for you is going to be fatally flawed, and I encourage you to do something about that. God bless, and bye for now.